Bernie Sanders is reportedly gearing up for a second campaign for president. According to Yahoo News, the Vermont senator and self-proclaimed Democratic socialist is expected to announce his candidacy in the coming days. Strong early polling numbers reportedly swayed Sanders' decision to run for office. Despite losing the Democratic nomination to Hillary Clinton in 2016, Sanders has remained a top candidate in the Democratic field for 2020. Joining us now, White House reporter at Yahoo, Hunter Walker. So, Hunter, how soon do you think Sanders might announce?
So I was able to report that he's going to make that announcement. What I said was imminently. So I can't define it more tightly than that, but, I would say probably by the next time I see you, he will already be on the way.
So it's happening. What do you think the deciding factor was for him to run?
So the sources I talked to were saying he was emboldened by these strong early polling numbers, particularly, and I actually didn't even realize this until I dived into the crosstabs a bit, but if you look into the numbers, he's actually one of the leading candidates, particularly among African American and Latino voters.
Wow.
And I think that's really important to him because this was a perceived weakness for him in 2016.
So why do you think that there's been this turn of the tide with certain voters for him? What's the message that's really resonating?
Well, one of these things about early polling is that they're notoriously unreliable. And part of that is they're really driven by name recognition.
Mm-hmm.
So this time around, and one of the sources I spoke to said this, he went from a relative unknown to one of the most recognizable characters in this really crowded field. So that's got to be part of it. And I think, that's given him strength all across the board. If you look at these numbers, him and Joe Biden are the two leading candidates. So he's got the name recognition and he's ready to go.
Which is fascinating because Bernie Sanders is sort of synonymous with progressive Democratic politics. Does that help him or hurt him when you're talking about a general election?
Well, he really reshaped the Democratic Party with his last run. And I think the whole party has moved a bit to the left. The progressive wing is much more vocal. One of his signature policy proposals is Medicare for all.
That's right.
And last year we saw a caucus launch in the House that now has 70 members calling only for that proposal. So, he's less of a fringe figure than he might have been last time around, but I do think there is still division in the party. And like I said, the leading candidates are him and Joe Biden. And you can really see that as the two most recognizable figures representing the two poles of the current Democratic Party.
What's interesting when you talk about the Democratic Party, recently they put a rule in place that these members must run and serve as members of the Democratic Party. Was that sort of a jab at Democratic socialists?
Well, 2016 was really divisive. I mean, I should say that, part of Bernie's impact is on the policy front. His vision has largely been adopted by a lot of members of the party. The other part of his impact is that there's these lingering tensions from 2016. And one of the side effects of that is we saw this unity commission established, focused on reform within the DNC. And members were appointed by both Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Bernie was kind of pushing for what he calls a more open and inclusive primary, getting rid of things like superdelegates. But right at the end of this rules change process, you saw this thing, slammed in there, where they kind of said, okay, you have to basically sign a loyalty oath to the Democratic Party.
Right.
And that could be seen as targeting an independent candidate like Bernie, but he's a little bit inoculated against it because he's got this long relationship with the Democratic Party in his home state of Vermont. And they gave him basically almost, you could consider it, a pass, where it was a document saying, we consider you a full-fledged member of our party going forward. So this rule change might affect other independents and socialists that pursue the presidency, but Bernie's going to be safe.
Hunter, yesterday we had on Democratic Representative Eric Swalwell, one of the many people potentially whose name has been out there floated to run. We asked him about this. I want to play that bite for you. I hear that you are hiring in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. Are you running?
Yes, send us your resumes. I am considering it, and I am going to be back in Iowa this weekend. I believe that the promise of our country is if you work hard, you do better for yourself and dream bigger for your kids. That's something my parents chase, but I don't see it being fulfilled on every block and on every floor of every building. So I want to make sure that we have new energy, new ideas, and a new confidence in America, and I'm going to make a decision about how I can help make sure that happens very soon.
Looks like we can add possibly another one to the list. How do you separate yourself, this massive list of Democratic candidates?
I mean, you're absolutely right. It is just massive at this point. I mean, we saw, I think last week, it all blurs together now, but we saw South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg come and enter the race. This field looks like it could be even bigger than the Republican primary we saw last time around with 17 candidates. And, that led to a pretty unpredictable outcome. So we could see that again. And it's not even just Democrats. There's news breaking today that Starbucks, CEO or the former leader of Starbucks, Howard Schultz, might do an independent bid. And that really has a lot of Democrats I've talked to worried because, they think they know the math, even with this gigantic Democratic field. But once you have an independent, and you're looking at Trump with his hardcore base, you're looking at a Democrat emerging from what will likely be a bruising, crowded primary, and then Schultz or someone else in the independent spot, it becomes even harder to predict who could win the overall election.
You've thrown that third person we've seen in previous elections decades ago.
And it might not just be three.
Yeah.
My colleague Matt Bai just had talked to John Kasich, and it looks like he's the former Republican governor of Ohio, and he might be doing a bid, and that could either be a primary to Trump on the Republican side or another independent in the race.
Incredible.
So this is going to be this is just bumper cars. It's going to be wild.
Bumper cars. I like that analogy. Hunter Walker, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.